Good morning and welcome to Morning Scoop for Friday, March 4th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The spring game is in 44 days, the Notre Dame game in 184 days, the game against Michigan in 268 days. We are inching a little closer each day to the start of spring football practice at Ohio State. This should be a fascinating spring for the Buckeyes with 4 new assistant coaches, including a new defensive coordinator to go along with the early enrollee freshmen, a couple of big-time transfers from Power 5 schools, plus the usual jockeying for starting jobs around the field. So there's going to be a bunch to talk about all spring. But beyond the obvious stuff, I wanted to know what Buckeye Scoop's X's and O's guru Ross Fulton was most interested in seeing this spring. He always kind of brings a unique perspective and insight on things, and he joins me now. Ross, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here, Tom.
So this is, there's always kind of this gradual process of learning from what we see at practice during the spring. Sometimes during the first practice, you kind of see a guy in a spot, you're like, wow, that's huge news, and then you never see him there again because they were just trying something out once just to see, because, what's the harm? It's one spring practice. But, over the course of the spring, you can typically learn a lot by kind of watching closely. So, because things will change through the course of the spring, and if a guy's moving up the depth chart, you can sort of see that as you progress through the spring. So, what is the first thing you're interested in maybe seeing during spring practice this year?
Yeah, I have to say probably mostly revolves around Jim Knowles' new defense. I think that involves both scheme and personnel, but just starting on the scheme side, I think in particular, how do they have the defensive line set up? How much are they in a 4-down front versus moving that weak side defensive end, what Knowles has called a Leo, around? Are they stacking that position much? Are they, mugging him, putting him up on the guard, doing some of the things that Knowles showed at Oklahoma State? So that would be my first. And I guess flowing from that is then, one thing that we've talked about in previous episodes is how do they have the defensive line playing? Are they switching to more of what Knowles has done in the past in terms of, sort of trying to clog up gaps and spill the football out to linebackers, as opposed to, each defensive lineman having their own gap and trying to get penetration upfield. So that would be sort of where I would start. And then I think there's some personnel questions off of that.
Yeah, the personnel off that is really interesting. Tony Gerdeman and I recorded an episode of Buckeye Weekly that's going to drop on Friday. So you'll be able to see that a little later on today. But one of the things we talked about, that was kind of our defensive line preview. And we started going through, who's going to be the strong side defensive ends and who's going to be the weak side defensive ends. And then the 3 techs and the nose. And, normally, last year it felt like the strong side and weak side there wasn't a huge difference between those two, and the guys kind of moved back and forth. This year it seems like maybe there's going to be more of a difference. And you've got guys who might move back and forth or be tried at least in both of those defensive, those interior spots. That feels like that's going to be really interesting as well to see, who Javonte Jean-Baptiste, is he going to be on the weak side? Is he going to be a strong side? Zach Harrison. We've talked about a bunch of these guys, but it feels like that's going to be a really interesting thing to see, because I have a feeling there's going to be a lot of mixing and matching throughout the spring there.
Agreed. And in fact, in previous years under Larry Johnson, they have not had an official strong side and weak side defensive end. Guys, they didn't use that designation. They didn't flip sides based on, the strong and weak. And so that will certainly be a change. And I agree, that'll be interesting. Similar, is a guy like Cade Stover at Leo. That wouldn't be something I'd be surprised. Yeah, I think, in particular, I'd say starting with where is Zach Harrison is probably a good starting point, because he's going to be a starter. So where do they have him in mind? I personally assume that he will be at Leo. And we'll see. And then, just body type wise, guys like him or, Jack Sawyer are more typical weak side defensive ends, where JT Tumaloa or, Tyler Friday are more your typical strong side defensive ends. But yeah, I think that'll be an interesting starting point. But there's personnel questions at all 3 levels that I think will be interesting.
Yeah, and then the other fun part of the new guys is you've got all these early enrollee freshmen. So Caden Curry, for example, he's someone who I think we spend a bunch of time talking about as a recruit, and there was a lot of hype around him, and where is he going to be? Is he going to be lined up on the strong side? Is he going to be on the weak side? And he's not. He's probably not going to be in the too deep to start, at least to start the spring. But he's another. You've got him. You've got Cade Stover, as you mentioned, is a bunch of different guys who are either moving to a new spot or arriving for the first time. It'll be fascinating to see where those guys all slot in.
Yeah, and I mean, I would extend that new conversation to Chip Trainum. I mean, I think how they use him will be really interesting. I think Knowles has sort of talked about him like a Swiss Army knife. I guess, I think he'd probably be a will linebacker, particularly given that the way that Knowles has talked about the nickel position is much more of like fitting a Tanner McAllister, who they brought in, and much more of a coverage guy that they're trying to keep out of the fit. So then you're really not going to have someone there who's sort of like an overhang, like we've talked about for like a Court Williams as well, who's more of like a linebacker safety hybrid that's really much more of a corner. And so, then you start seeing that. And then, I mean, they have so many linebackers. I couldn't even, they at least a dozen linebackers at this point for essentially two positions. And so, that'll be really interesting where they slot them too, in terms of, Mike versus Will. I mean, I wouldn't be, I could see a scenario where they move Steel Chambers to Mike and put, Trainum and or potentially Court Williams as Will linebackers and try to get smaller because, one thing that Knowles is, again, as I said, like he tends to like to spill the ball. And so by that, you're going sideline to sideline. So you want to make sure like both your linebackers can run. He uses them in coverage. So, again, how that impacts, say, a Tommy Eichenberg, there's like less of a need for, at least in his defense is traditionally played for like a more traditional Mike linebacker. On the other hand, again, to the 4 down front discussion, like the Big Ten brings some different challenges, particularly with Ohio State's schedule next year, including both Iowa and Wisconsin. So again, there's just lots of moving pieces, and Cody Simon as well in terms of him recovering from injury. So linebacker, I do think, you and I have talked about this before, like people underestimate what you can glean from like seeing the first parts of practice, but like how they line people up for drills does tell you a lot in terms of like the pecking order, like guys who are first string get to go first. Like last fall when people were like, well, Mayan Williams is taking the first team tailback reps, and like lo and behold, Mayan Williams started. And same thing with Ronnie Hickman, taking the first snaps throughout his safety. And so you can quickly pick up on that stuff. And, I'm sure the coaches have thought through all of it. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, I think linebacker is just a giant question mark in terms of, and then again, sort of, I again put Court Williams in that Cade Stover conversation, but just sort of like, is he on the other side of it? Is he a linebacker? Is he a boundary safety behind Hickman? I think he's another one that'll be interesting to see where they put him.
I'm also kind of interested to see, is the Sam linebacker a thing anymore? I mean, I know they're looking at a 4-2-5, but with a Wisconsin on the schedule, with an Iowa on the schedule, is that Sam linebacker, whether it's Pala'i Teote or someone else in that spot, is that a thing that exists anymore, or is that just a complete thing of the past? And we will never see them line up with 3 linebackers this year. I'm going to be interested to see if we see a 3 linebacker alignment at some point this spring.
Yeah, I will. My personal opinion is I will be very surprised if there's a third linebacker at any time. I mean, that's not how Knowles defended, say, Iowa State, who uses a ton of 2 tight end, 12 personnel, or teams like that. Like they may have been the shotgun, but they still were presenting that extra gap. But that said, that would maybe be something that we wouldn't see in the spring, really, because like the reps you're going to see them is against the Ohio State offense, and that's not a situation where Knowles would ever use a third linebacker. But yeah, so I guess you could see a scenario where that's like I guess even if they do it, let's say it be someone who's playing meaningful snaps and 2 to 3 games and I guess goal line reps. So it's not, it would be definitely a niche piece at the most. But yes, I agree. It will be interesting, I think, structurally, again, how Knowles adapts to facing, in particular, like Iowa and Michigan's one thing where like, yeah, they use a lot of 2 tight ends, but they're still a spread team that throws RPOs that you have to deal with versus like, Wisconsin or Iowa, which are like true pro style I formation teams.
All right, and is there something else then at the third level of defense? You mentioned there was something kind of at each level. So when you're looking at the secondary, is it the safety alignment? What are you most interested to see in terms of the back end of the defense?
Yeah, I mean, always interested in the safety. I mean, I will be very interested in what kind of coverage schemes they're using. What they sort of seem to be hanging their hat on. Whether it's types of cover four, and then again, the things we've talked about, like, are they man matching within that, which means, guarding a man and then trading off? Are they zone matching? How are they handling that? And then, personnel wise, again, see where some guys are slotted, like, with Josh Proctor back from, assuming he's back in the spring, like, what's the pecking order at that field safety position? We won't be able to see Latham Ransom, but like guys like him and like Cam Martinez, interested where they put them, since they kind of bumped back and forth between the nickel corner and the field safety last year. So again, it's sort of how do they assess the players that they have?
All right, and then what about on the other side of the ball? I feel like there's not a ton of drama in the pecking order at quarterback, for example, or something like that. But there's a bunch of interesting kind of positional battles, and how much is how many carries is Trevian Henderson going to get this year versus Mine Williams, and probably I feel like we have a decent sense who the starting three might be at the wide receiver position. At least pick from on these four guys, and you'll have the three wide receivers, but. What are you maybe most interested in seeing this spring on the offensive side of the ball?
Yeah, I'll give you like one scheme and one personnel. So scheme wise, I'm interested if Justin Fry, and maybe just as a byproduct of Justin Fry, not to necessarily give him all the credit, but like whether they diversify and or change up their run game at all. I mean, whether that's using, more gap schemes, and more, running zone plays to the halfback side. As we talked about last year, they got pretty predictable in terms of throwing when the back was in, offset, and running when they're in pistol or under center. And so seeing if they're addressing that or at all, or attempting to. And then personnel wise, like I would start with tight end. I think that's a big question mark. I've personally been on the train of getting Mitch Rossi back was big, because I could certainly see him as getting the majority of snaps as the offset tight end. But then also, and then I guess secondary to that is the offensive line. And, to me, it feels like they're pretty locked in, except for maybe at one guard position, which I assume will be a battle between Harry Miller and Donovan Jackson. But we'll have to see how they see how they think it will shake out.
Yeah, I mean, the offensive line is really interesting, because it feels like, there are probably six guys who are probably in that mix for five. And if you've got six guys for five, that's not a bad problem to have, as long as they all stick around for the fall. That was kind of the situation they had last year. But yeah, then you've got that second string on the offensive line. You feel like, there are probably a couple guys where you could kind of pencil in, but there's also some spots on that second string that might be pretty wide open. Tight end is fascinating to me, because before the Rose Bowl last year, you kept hearing great stuff about how great Joe Royer looked in practice. And oh man, just wait till you see Joe Royer. And then I don't think he actually played in the Rose Bowl. So
no, I agree. And I still haven't seen him. I was, when I saw him at the Rose Bowl, I mean, he still looks a little slight to me, but we'll see. And then, related to that is like, what, if any, role does G Scott have? Again, he's really kind of a tweener still. I mean, in terms of like his length and stuff. And so, I think he would definitely have to be still sort of like a tight end receiver hybrid type. But yeah, so they have some interesting body types there. But, like at the end of the day, to me, the first and foremost thing they need from a tight end is the blocking aspect of it, which I thought was a pretty significant drop off last year compared to in previous years. And so, that's the first thing that needs shored up before even worrying about, what they add to. Obviously, you have, at the very least, four really good receivers that have now played pretty significant snaps, and they feel good about, obviously.
Yeah, the tight end's going to be interesting, because it does feel like they maybe have all the different pieces of a tight end, but not necessarily in one body. So they may have to kind of piece things together in a little bit of a different way than they did before. But
exactly. And then you have to worry about, when you do that, you obviously then again don't want to be predictable. You don't want the defense to know, here comes the receiving tight end. Here comes, we know Mitch Rossi's into block. And so you gotta balance those factors out.
Yeah, that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. And I mean, we have not really seen Sam Hart. We have not really seen Joe Royer. We haven't really seen G. Scott much since he moved to tight end in terms of just running plays and being on the practice field and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of that, even the guys who've been around for a few years, is kind of going to be a little new and exciting this spring to see those guys out there. So should be that is a good little run through some of the really interesting things to kind of keep an eye on as we kind of progress through spring ball. And as Ross said, you see where the guys are, but the running order at the beginning of spring, that tells you something. And then 5 to 7 practices in, we'll probably get to see them again. And then if sometimes you see guys moving up, moving down, that can tell you a lot about where things might be headed as you move through the spring.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't mean that it's set in stone, but it does mean that they think coming into spring, this is what they think would be the their lineup. Now, it doesn't mean that they practice bears it out, but it gives you a an insight in the coaches' thinking during the off season.
So yeah, that should be a lot. That'll be very interesting to see because we've got 4 new assistant coaches, so a lot of these guys, this is a little bit more theoretical. They've seen them on film maybe, but they don't really know the guys necessarily yet as much as the coaches last year would have. So it'll be interesting to see what the first impressions are, and then how those maybe change throughout the spring as they see those guys on the field. Ross, let people know where they can find you on Twitter, because you are always a very interesting follow on Twitter as you're sort of breaking stuff down and sharing some insight on the what's actually going on the field during these games.
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot to remember my Twitter handle. I think it's Ross R. Fulton.
It is. Good job. Ross knew the answer to that one as well. Very nicely done. So yes, at Ross R. Fulton on Twitter. And if you look at the post on BuckeyeScoop.com for this podcast, we'll have that linked in his, when you click on his name, that'll take you to his Twitter page. So that'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.